She whispered it like a warning. If he finds out, everything changes. And suddenly, nothing would ever be the same. The evening air carried a soft warmth, the kind that made the golden light spilling through the kitchen window seem almost alive. I had dropped by my friend's house under the pretense of helping him with a late-night study session, but the quiet hum of the house hinted that the night had its own plans. I lingered by the doorway, hesitant, when I saw her, my friend's mother, moving gracefully around the kitchen. She had that calm, effortless elegance that didn't scream for attention, but quietly demanded it. A soft blouse, the sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal slender forearms, her hair catching the light in gentle waves. She looked like someone who had lived fully, someone with stories hidden behind her serene smile. When our eyes met, the room seemed to shrink for a heartbeat. She gave me a small, knowing smile, the kind that suggested she understood far more than she let on. I felt a sudden, inexplicable awareness of my own awkwardness, the way my hands lingered too long in my pockets. There was something magnetic in her presence, a quiet gravity I wasn't ready for. I stepped forward, trying to sound casual, though my voice caught slightly. Hi, Mrs. Daniels. I'm just grabbing some tea." Her smile softened, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "Of course. You've been studying all evening, haven't you? You look like you could use a break." She moved closer, holding a mug of steaming tea. The scent, subtle vanilla with earthy undertones, drifted toward me, warm and comforting. As she handed me the cup, our fingers brushed lightly. It was only a fleeting touch, a fraction of a second, but it lingered in my mind. That faint contact sent a small, unspoken jolt through me, and I realized how aware I was of her proximity, of the warmth radiating from her hand to mine. She caught my hesitation and tilted her head slightly, her expression curious, almost teasing, without ever needing words. We moved through small talk, the kind that could have been ordinary, comments about the weather, the homework I was supposed to be doing, but there was a rhythm to our interaction that felt intimate. Her voice was calm, low, and steady, wrapping around me in a way that made the room feel smaller, safer, and at the same time, charged with something I couldn't yet name. Even in the mundane act of passing me a teaspoon for my tea, there was a quiet grace. I noticed the soft rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the subtle brush of her hair as she tucked a loose strand behind her ear. Each movement was effortless, but to me, it carried a weight, a presence I couldn't ignore. By the time I sat at the kitchen table with my tea, I realized the connection wasn't just about a polite gesture or passing familiarity. Something unspoken had been planted in that soft, fleeting moment, a curiosity, a pull, a question neither of us dared voice. It was the kind of spark that promises complexity, the kind of connection that could quietly, irrevocably, change everything. And just like that, without a word beyond polite greetings and small gestures, the night had begun, and I had already lost track of time, and perhaps a little piece of my composure, to the quiet gravity of her presence. The house had quieted after the faint sounds of my friend settling into his own corner of the living room. I found myself lingering, cup of tea in hand, aware that I was alone with her for the first time without any interruptions. The soft lamplight bathed the room in warm hues, highlighting the subtle lines around her eyes, the calmness in her posture. She was sitting on the sofa, legs tucked neatly under her, and as I approached, I noticed the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, mingling with the gentle aroma of the tea. "Care to join me?" she asked, patting the space beside her. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, yet carried the kind of warmth that made you want to step closer. I settled down, careful to respect the space between us, but close enough to notice the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders as she exhaled. We started talking about trivial things at first, books we'd read, music we liked, movies that had stuck with us long after the credits rolled. But gradually, her stories began to reveal pieces of her life, hints of past challenges, the moments that had shaped her into the graceful, composed woman sitting beside me. She spoke with a quiet honesty, not seeking sympathy, but simply letting her words flow. I found myself opening up more than I expected. I spoke about my own insecurities, my uncertainties about the future, the pressures of balancing responsibilities and dreams. And somehow, she listened, truly listened, without judgment, her gaze steady and attentive. I could feel the subtle reassurance in the way she leaned slightly forward, the faint tilt of her head as she considered my words. There was a moment when our hands accidentally brushed while reaching for our mugs. I froze, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she lingered, her fingertips just grazing mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary. It was a small, almost imperceptible touch, yet it carried a warmth and familiarity that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. Her eyes met mine, holding a flicker of curiosity and perhaps something unspoken, a shared recognition of this quiet, growing connection. Laughter came easily between us, light and effortless, yet there was a pause after each joke, a lingering glance that seemed to carry meaning. I became aware of the softness of her smile, the subtle way her fingers flexed around the mug, the gentle tilt of her head that suggested openness and trust. Every little detail felt magnified in the intimate stillness of the room. By the time the conversation drew to a natural lull, I realized that I was no longer just seeing my friend's mom. I was seeing a person, layered, complex, human. Someone whose presence could make the room feel both smaller and infinitely expansive at the same time. The connection between us had quietly deepened, unspoken yet undeniable. And in that calm, unassuming evening, I understood that this wasn't just a chance encounter. Something significant had begun, a subtle, magnetic pull that promised complexity, understanding, and perhaps a shared closeness neither of us had anticipated. The night had shifted, and so had the nature of our relationship, leaving me acutely aware of the tension and warmth simmering just beneath the surface. Later that night, the house had settled into an almost sacred quiet. My friend had retreated to his room, the soft click of his door echoing down the hall. I found myself lingering in the backyard, where the moonlight spilled over the grass, turning the garden into a silvery, almost ethereal space. She appeared there quietly, a cup of tea in her hands, and for a moment, I was struck by the effortless way she moved, poised, yet somehow relaxed in the night's embrace. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, my voice low, careful not to shatter the fragile calm. She smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Something like that. Sometimes it helps to step outside, clear your head." She gestured toward the garden path, where shadows and light danced in a gentle rhythm. We walked slowly, not side by side, but close enough that the warmth from her body seeped subtly into my awareness. The night air was cool, tinged with the scent of damp earth and faint jasmine from the bushes along the fence. Each step felt charged, though neither of us spoke about it. Then, almost hesitantly, she spoke. Her voice dropped, a soft murmur against the gentle rustle of leaves. "Sometimes, there are things you can't share with anyone. Things you hold close because if anyone else knew, everything would change." She paused, and the weight of her words hung between us like the still night. I felt my chest tighten. The tone in her voice, quiet, almost confessional, made the air around us feel heavier. "What do you mean?" I asked softly, my curiosity tempered by the unmistakable tension in her words. She took a small step closer, just enough that I could feel her presence more acutely, without any overt gesture. Her hand brushed lightly against mine as she adjusted the sleeve of her blouse, and the touch, though fleeting, sent a shiver up my spine. "It's complicated," she murmured. "Some things, they can't be shared. Not with anyone. Not even those closest to you." The unspoken implication made my heart beat faster. I realized then that whatever connection we had been building, the easy laughter, the shared stories, the fleeting touches, carried a new weight. There was risk now. Danger. And yet, there was an undeniable pull, a magnetic tension that made me want to lean in closer, even though every rational thought warned me against it. We lingered there in silence, the moonlight catching the slight curve of her lips as she considered her words. I could see the vulnerability beneath her confident exterior, a quiet honesty that made her more compelling than ever. I noticed the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders, the way her hair caught the silver light, and how the night seemed to hold its breath alongside us. Finally, she looked up, meeting my gaze directly. Her eyes held a mixture of warning and something else, something raw, quietly urgent, and impossible to ignore. "If anyone found out," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft rustle of leaves, "everything changes." The words lingered long after she turned away, leaving me acutely aware of the forbidden, fragile connection that had just begun to take shape. And in that moonlit garden, I realized that nothing about our relationship would ever be ordinary again. The morning sun filtered softly through the kitchen blinds, casting golden stripes across the polished wooden floor. I had arrived earlier than usual to help my friend with some notes, but as soon as I stepped inside, the stillness of the house pulled my attention elsewhere. She was there, quietly sorting through a stack of old letters on the counter, her expression distant, eyes focused on the delicate paper as if it held pieces of a life she rarely spoke of. I hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt or give her space. She looked up briefly, catching my gaze, and offered a small, tired smile. It was not the confident, composed smile from our earlier encounters, but one tinged with quiet fragility. There was a softness in her features that made her suddenly approachable, human in a way that demanded empathy. "Morning," I said softly, stepping closer. My voice seemed louder in the gentle morning hush. "Morning," she replied, her voice lighter than I expected, almost relieved to have someone there. She didn't hide the stack of letters. Instead, she gestured toward them as if inviting me into a piece of her world. "Just going through some old things," she murmured. I moved closer, standing beside her at the counter. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of the paper, creating an unexpectedly comforting atmosphere. She didn't make any effort to hide her emotions, the faint trembling of her hands as she shuffled the letters, the slight tension in her shoulders, and I found myself instinctively reaching out to offer some small reassurance. My hand rested lightly on her shoulder, a grounding touch meant to convey support rather than intimacy. She didn't flinch. Instead, her body relaxed subtly under my hand, as if silently acknowledging the comfort in human contact. The warmth of her skin, the quiet steadiness of her breathing, and the gentle pulse at the base of her neck made my awareness of her presence more acute. I realized that this was not a moment of romance, yet it carried the intimacy of trust, the kind that forms quietly, imperceptibly, between people who genuinely see and accept one another. We didn't speak much at first. Words seemed unnecessary. I watched her carefully, noticing the small, almost imperceptible gestures, the way her fingers lingered on the envelope edges, the slight frown of her brow, the gentle sigh that escaped her lips. There was vulnerability here that she rarely allowed anyone to witness. And in that shared silence, I felt the quiet bond between us deepen. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but steady. "It's strange how certain things from the past can still weigh on you, even when you think you've let go." I nodded, understanding more than I could articulate. She glanced at me, and her eyes held gratitude, something unspoken but profoundly clear. In that moment, the distance between us shrank. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was deeply personal, an emotional closeness that lingered in the air, thick and comforting. I felt the significance of the trust she had placed in me, and I knew that our connection was moving beyond casual interactions. As I finally stepped back to leave, the warmth of her presence remained with me, a quiet reminder that the heart's quiet connections, the ones built through vulnerability and understanding, are often more powerful than words or gestures ever could be. And I knew, without doubt, that the bond forming between us was only beginning. The evening brought a soft rain, tapping rhythmically against the window panes, and the living room felt cocooned in warmth and quiet. My friend had gone out for a moment, leaving us alone on the sofa, and the space between us suddenly felt charged with an unspoken electricity. I took a seat beside her, careful not to overstep, yet aware of how the simple proximity made my chest tighten. We were watching a movie, or at least pretending to. The flickering light from the screen reflected in her eyes, catching the subtle golden flecks I hadn't noticed before. Every now and then, her knee brushed lightly against mine, accidental, or perhaps not entirely so, and I found myself acutely aware of the warmth radiating from her. Each brush sent a ripple of tension through me, a quiet acknowledgement that our connection was growing beyond casual interaction. Her laughter, soft and genuine, punctuated the scenes, and I realized how attuned I had become to the subtleties of her expressions. The curve of her lips, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the slight lift of her eyebrows, all of it drew me in, made me notice her in ways I hadn't before. When she glanced at me after a particularly funny moment, our eyes met and held just a second too long, a silent exchange charged with curiosity and something deeper, something forbidden. At one point, I reached to adjust the blanket draped across the sofa, and our hands brushed again. This time, the contact lingered just a fraction longer. I felt the softness of her skin, the warmth of her fingers, and the gentle pressure that conveyed a subtle, mutual acknowledgement of our growing intimacy. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand rest near mine, almost as if testing the boundary between comfort and desire. The room seemed to shrink around us. The sound of rain, the flickering light, the faint scent of her perfume mixed with the earthy aroma of wet air outside, it all heightened my awareness of her presence. Every glance she gave, every smile, every movement of her hand or the tilt of her head felt laden with meaning. Words weren't necessary. The tension between us spoke volumes. I noticed the quiet confidence in her posture, the effortless way she occupied space, and yet there was vulnerability too, a softness in the way she allowed these small, fleeting touches. I found myself drawn to it, craving the subtle reassurance that came with proximity, with shared silence, with lingering looks that said everything without speaking a word. And then there was the pause, that almost imperceptible hesitation in her eyes when she looked at me, the slight catch in her breath as our fingers accidentally brushed once more. In that moment, it was clear, something had shifted. What had begun as polite curiosity and friendly warmth had evolved into a delicate tension, a quiet desire held carefully beneath the surface, unspoken but undeniable. By the time my friend returned, the air between us was heavy with what had not been said. We resumed ordinary conversation, laughter masking the magnetic pull that hummed quietly beneath every gesture, every glance. And yet I knew the slow-burning tension had only grown stronger, a subtle, electric thread connecting us, impossible to ignore and impossible to name just yet. The backyard was quiet again, the remnants of the day's rain leaving a fresh, earthy scent that clung to the grass. Twilight had settled over the garden, painting everything in muted purples and blues, and the soft rustle of leaves in the gentle wind made the space feel private, almost sacred. We stood there, side by side, yet the distance between us felt heavier than usual, weighted with unspoken truths. Her gaze was fixed on the faint ripples in the small fountain at the edge of the yard, but I could feel her awareness of me, like a silent pulse stretching through the space between us. The tension from our earlier interactions, the fleeting touches, the lingering glances, the quiet laughter, had shifted into something more tangible. The forbidden nature of what we were developing hovered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and measured. "We need to talk," she said, turning her eyes to meet mine. There was no hesitation in her tone, only a quiet firmness that contrasted with the vulnerability she had shown in other moments. "About what's happening between us?" I swallowed, aware of the sudden tightness in my chest. I had anticipated this conversation, yet the reality of her words made the consequences feel very real. I know," I murmured, my voice barely above the whisper of the wind. "I feel it too." She nodded, and for a moment we simply stood there, letting the night wrap around us. Then she stepped closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her, without any overt gesture. Her hand brushed lightly against mine, an almost unconscious act, grounding us both in the shared intensity of the moment. "If anyone found out the way things are," she continued, her voice dropping to a murmur that seemed meant only for me, "everything would change. Not just for us, but for everyone around us. The consequences, they're real." I reached for her hand, taking it gently in mine. The contact was grounding, reassuring, but it also carried an unspoken acknowledgement of desire and understanding. Her fingers pressed lightly against mine, and the warmth of her skin, the subtle rhythm of her pulse, and the quiet steadiness of her presence made my chest ache with a mixture of longing and apprehension. "I know," I said again, more firmly this time. I'm aware of the risk. I'm aware of everything. But I can't ignore how I feel. Her eyes softened, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through the composed exterior. She leaned slightly toward me, the faintest brush of her shoulder against mine. It's not just about what we feel, she whispered. It's about what we choose to do with it. About holding it carefully, quietly, so we don't destroy what we care about. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of damp earth and rain-soaked leaves. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of us, her warmth, the brush of her hand, the steadying weight of her presence. The tension between desire and restraint was palpable, a silent acknowledgement that we were both aware of the line we couldn't cross openly, yet irresistibly drawn to one another. As we stood together, side by side in the fading twilight, the weight of reality didn't lessen, but the connection between us deepened. It was a careful, deliberate closeness, a promise of understanding, trust, and shared vulnerability. And even as the risk loomed over us, the quiet intimacy of that moment became a secret refuge, a slow-burning bond that neither distance nor circumstance could diminish. The house had quieted once more. The rain had stopped, leaving the garden glistening under the pale light of the moon. Inside, the soft glow of the living room lamp bathed everything in warmth, creating a cocooned sense of privacy that seemed almost sacred. I found her sitting on the sofa, curled slightly into the cushions, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. She looked up as I entered, offering a small, tired smile that carried more meaning than words ever could. I hesitated, then sat down beside her, careful to respect the space between us, yet drawn by the magnetic pull that had been building for weeks. There was no need for grand declarations or overt gestures. The unspoken understanding between us was enough, a bond formed from quiet conversations, fleeting touches, and shared vulnerabilities. She shifted slightly, leaning toward me ever so gently, and I felt the warmth of her shoulder brushing mine. It was a subtle contact, almost accidental, but it carried with it a depth of comfort and trust that went far beyond the physical. Her hand found mine, resting lightly in a natural, unforced gesture. The simple touch conveyed more than words ever could: safety, understanding, and the quiet acknowledgement of shared emotion. We didn't speak immediately. Instead, we sat in companionable silence, the gentle hum of the house wrapping around us. I could feel her steadying presence beside me, the faint rhythm of her pulse under my palm, the warmth radiating from her, as she exhaled softly. Every detail, the subtle curve of her lips as she relaxed, the way her hair fell gently over her shoulder, the soft tilt of her head, spoke to the intimacy we had quietly cultivated. Finally she spoke, her voice a gentle murmur that blended perfectly with the stillness of the night. "I'm glad it's just us right now," she said. "No expectations, no consequences, just this." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of trust and mutual understanding. I squeezed her hand gently, feeling the warmth and steadiness beneath my fingertips. "Just this," I repeated, letting the phrase settle between us like a promise. The tension that had defined our interactions for so long softened into something far richer, a quiet, enduring closeness that didn't need drama or spectacle to feel profound. The night stretched on, and we remained side by side, hands intertwined, sharing small smiles, quiet laughter, and the occasional meaningful glance. There was no rush, no need to define what had grown between us. The connection was alive simply in its presence, in the shared comfort of being understood and accepted. As I finally rose to leave, she didn't let go of my hand immediately. Instead, she rested her head lightly against my shoulder for a heartbeat longer, a subtle, intimate gesture that spoke volumes. In that fleeting contact, I felt the culmination of weeks of quiet tension, emotional discovery, and mutual respect. The pull, the vulnerability, and the unspoken desire had been transformed into something enduring and warm, a slow-burning intimacy that promised patience, understanding, and trust. Stepping out into the cool night, I carried the quiet warmth of that moment with me. Whatever the future held, the connection we had built, tender, respectful, and deeply human, had reached its own beautiful resolution. And for the first time in a long while, I understood that some bonds are more powerful for being felt rather than named.